ever stop to think about those, really dramatic predictions of the world's end, the fire, the beast, that whole final showdown scenario? It's definitely something that's grabbed people's imaginations for, well, centuries.
Absolutely.
Today, we're taking a direct look at a book that tries to unpack all that. We're focusing on maybe the most talked about and often the most puzzling book of the Bible, Revelation.
That's right. We're diving deep into Bart D. Ehrman's Armageddon, what the Bible really says about the end. And look, even if you think you've got a pretty good handle on Revelation, Ehrman's analysis, it offers some genuinely surprising takes.
Okay.
Our goal here in this deep dive is really to move past the sensationalism, and try to understand what this prominent New Testament scholar argues was the original meaning, the original context of the book of Revelation.
So think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to really understanding a topic that's fueled, countless interpretations and predictions over the years. What's really key, right off the bat, is that Ehrman challenges almost everything we commonly think we know about the end times.
Yeah, he really does.
He's not just offering a slightly different opinion. He's meticulously digging into the historical roots of this text.
And for this deep dive, just so everyone knows, our source material isn't just Ehrman's book. We're also looking at how his arguments landed with other scholars.
Yeah.
Where they agree, the critiques, the ongoing debates.
Right, getting the bigger picture.
Exactly. It gives us a much richer, more nuanced understanding of where his work fits in the broader field.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What's the one core argument Ehrman makes that's really shaking things up?
Well, his central thesis, and this is really crucial to grasp, is that the popular ways people understand Revelation, they're almost certainly not what the original author meant.
Okay, how so?
He argues that both the fundamentalist, sort of evangelical view, Revelation as a literal prediction of future events.
Right, like a roadmap.
Exactly. And also the more liberal interpretation that sees it as simply a general message of hope, he thinks both fundamentally misunderstand the text.
So he doesn't subscribe to that idea, the one where specific verses map onto current global events, like pieces of a puzzle?
Precisely. He strongly rejects what he calls futurist literalism. He's really critical of that jigsaw puzzle approach.
Yeah.
Where figures like Hal Lindsey or Tim LaHaye from the Left Behind books, Edgar Wiesnan, they take these isolated verses from all over the Bible.
Ripped out of context.
Essentially, yes. And they assemble them into this supposed chronological timeline of the end. Ehrman argues that method completely ignores the historical and literary context of those passages. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. Context is always key, isn't it? So what does Ehrman say about that original context? What's so important for us to understand there?
He really insists that Revelation is a first-century apocalyptic text. It was written for a specific audience, facing very particular circumstances at that time.
Apocalyptic literature, can you remind us what that typically involves?
Sure. Think of it as a style of writing pretty common back then in Jewish and early Christian circles. It often uses really symbolic language, dramatic visions of the future, usually written during times of crisis or perceived oppression.
Okay.
So it's less about literal prediction for us thousands of years later, and much more about getting a message across, maybe hope, maybe warning within that specific historical setting under the Roman Empire.
Can you give us some concrete examples how Ehrman decodes these symbols by looking at the history?
Absolutely. Take the famous 666, right? The number of the beast.
Always captures attention.
It does. Ehrman argues it's highly likely a coded reference to Emperor Nero. It uses gematria, that system where letters have numerical values.
The number letter code.
Exactly. And Babylon the Great, another huge symbol in the book. That wasn't some future global power. For the first century reader, it was a pretty clear stand-in for Rome, the oppressive Roman Empire.
Okay, that makes sense historically.
And what's also really significant, and something you should note, is that the author repeatedly says these things are going to happen soon, like imminently.
Soon, right.
Which, doesn't really fit well with interpretations that push these events thousands of years into our future.
That really does shift your perspective. Okay, what about the other common idea? That Revelation offers a message of hope and comfort, especially for people suffering. Does Ehrman challenge that too?
He does, yeah. While he acknowledges the book does address the suffering of early Christians, he argues the main themes aren't primarily comfort and reassurance.
No. Then what are they?
He argues it's overwhelmingly about divine wrath, judgment, and, frankly, terrifying violence directed at God's enemies. And he contends that, in the book's view, that includes the vast majority of humanity.
So for most people in Revelation's vision, it's not exactly good news, according to Ehrman.
Not at all. He points out the actual word hope doesn't even appear in the book of Revelation, not once.
Really? I never noticed that.
Yeah. And the seemingly happy ending, the New Jerusalem, in his interpretation, that's reserved for a pretty small group of faithful followers. The text actually calls them God's slaves.
Slaves, huh?
Mm-hmm. For everyone else, the future depicted is quite bleak. Plagues, the Battle of Armageddon, and then, an eternity in a lake of fire.
Wow. That's a stark contrast to the popular image, maybe of universal salvation or widespread hope. But I can imagine some scholars might take issue with how Ehrman frames those opposing views.
You're absolutely right. That's a key critique. Some argue Ehrman might be creating a bit of a straw man here.
How so?
By presenting futurist literalism, the roadmap idea, and metaphorical hope as basically the only two options for interpreting Revelation.
When there are others.
Exactly. There are other well-established scholarly approaches. You have preterism, for instance.
Right. The view that most of it already happened in the first century.
Precisely. Or idealism, which sees Revelation more as a symbolic picture of the constant struggle between good and evil throughout all history. So, by focusing heavily on critiquing those very popular interpretations, some argue he might be overlooking some of the nuances within the more academic discussions about the book.
Okay, so let's delve deeper into Ehrman's own interpretation then. What is Revelation actually saying, according to him? He really emphasizes understanding its literary style as apocalyptic, right?
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
He stresses that if you really want to understand Revelation, you have to recognize and understand the conventions of apocalyptic literature.
The rules of the genre, so to speak.
Exactly. These texts often involve first-person accounts, symbolic visions, heavenly secrets getting revealed to explain earthly events and predict that God's about to step in dramatically and soon. It's a very specific kind of writing.
And within that specific genre, he keeps pointing us back to the original history.
Always. He reiterates that the first century Greco-Roman world, the Jewish context, that's the essential key to unlocking what Revelation meant to its first audience. We already mentioned Babylon as Rome, 666 as Nero. He also talks about the ongoing debate among scholars about when exactly Revelation was written. Was it under Emperor Nero or later under Domitian?
Does it matter which one?
Well, traditionally, it's often dated to Domitian's reign, who was also associated with persecuting Christians. But Ehrman points out that the actual historical evidence for massive state-sponsored persecution under Domitian, it's actually quite limited.
Huh. Interesting. So if it wasn't necessarily this huge empire-wide persecution driving it, what does Ehrman think fueled the really intense, often violent language in Revelation?
Ehrman suggests that even if the persecution wasn't a systematic empire-wide campaign, the author John of Patmos and his specific community, they likely faced serious local pressures, or at least they perceived a very real and significant threat.
So a strong sense of crisis.
Exactly. Whether based on widespread reality or maybe amplified local experiences, that sense of crisis would fuel these dramatic symbolic visions within that apocalyptic framework he keeps talking about.
And a dominant feature of that vision, according to Ehrman, is violence, like a lot of violence.
Undeniably. He argues divine retribution is just central. It's inescapable in the text. In his view, the book is primarily concerned with God's imminent wrath and vengeance, aimed at a sinful world, but with a laser focus on the Roman Empire as the main oppressor.
So he sees it as a narrative that anticipates, maybe even celebrates, divine judgment and bloody revenge.
That's his interpretation, yes. A stark contrast to the messages of love and forgiveness we often associate with the New Testament.
The descriptions of the plagues, the Battle of Armageddon, It is pretty graphic stuff.
It really is. Ehrman emphasizes how pervasive the violent imagery is. The opening of the seals, the sounding of the trumpets, the pouring out of the bowls, all unleashing catastrophic plagues.
Right.
And it culminates in that climactic Battle of Armageddon where Christ himself is depicted as the main agent of destruction, slaughtering armies, inviting birds to feast on corpses. Very. And then, of course, the final judgment scene, the lake of fire imagery. Even if you interpret some of this symbolically, Ehrman argues the author's consistent choice of such brutal imagery reveals a mindset deeply concerned with divine payback.
He even offers a rather severe interpretation of that message to the church in Thyatira about Jezebel.
Yes, his reading of Jesus' threat to throw her on a bed, the Greek word is klinia, and kill her children, is quite harsh.
How so?
Ehrman suggests it implies sexual degradation and divine infanticide, understood symbolically within that apocalyptic context. Now, it's important for you to know, this specific interpretation has faced criticism.
Okay. What do critics say?
Other scholars argue it might be an overly negative reading. They suggest "kline" could potentially be an idiom for a sickbed.
So illness as punishment, not necessarily literal violence.
Right. Representing illness as a form of divine punishment rather than something more literally violent or degrading. It's a point of debate.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for now. What's Ehrman's take on wealth and power in Revelation? Does he see it as just a blanket condemnation?
Not entirely, no. Ehrman argues that while Revelation certainly condemns the Roman Empire's extreme wealth and exploitation, symbolized by Babylon the Great, right? It doesn't necessarily reject the concept of wealth itself. Instead, he thinks the author believes wealth is just currently in the wrong hands, the pagan Romans.
Okay,
So he posits that the author anticipates a future wealth transfer to the faithful Christians.
Oh, wealth transfer. Seriously. So in Ehrman's reading, the believers eventually get all the riches.
That's his argument. He points to those opulent descriptions of the New Jerusalem, the city of gold, jewels, pearls.
Yeah, it's very luxurious.
He sees that as evidence of this future prosperity for the believers. And he draws a sharp contrast between this vision and Jesus' warnings in the Gospels about the dangers of wealth.
So there's a clash there.
A definite clash in his view. Ehrman even interprets the millennium, that 1,000-year reign described in Revelation 20. He interprets that, partly influenced by D.H. Lawrence, interestingly enough, as the period of this great wealth transfer. God takes the riches from the defeated Romans and gives them to the previously poor Christians, who then get to rule in splendor.
That's a pretty specific and almost literal-sounding take on the millennium, especially considering how much he critiques literalism elsewhere. Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. Ehrman essentially argues for a fairly literal premillennial view, meaning Jesus returns to Earth before the 1,000-year period starts.
Okay.
He establishes an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem, and the Christian martyrs are physically resurrected to reign alongside him.
Right, the standard premillennial idea. But what's Ehrman's twist?
The crucial aspect of his interpretation is that the millennium is also payback time. It's when these martyrs get their vengeance on their former persecutors, who are apparently still alive somehow.
Vengeance during the millennium.
That's his reading. He points to passages like Revelation 6, where the souls under the altar are crying out, "How long, O Lord, until you judge and avenge our blood?" He sees the millennium as the answer to that cry.
Oh. That sounds a bit contradictory to the idea of a peaceful, loving reign, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
And Ehrman himself sort of acknowledges a tension in his own method here.
How so?
While he strongly critiques futurist literalism in general, his interpretation of the millennium and these future rewards seems quite literal and very materialistic.
Right.
Some critics have even called his view of the millennium somewhat crass or maybe hyper-literal.
Yeah.
This selective use of literalism really allows him to emphasize the vengeful and materialistic sides of Revelation.
Which fits his bigger argument.
Exactly. It fits his broader argument about how different Revelation is from the teachings found in the Gospels.
Which brings us to what is maybe the most thought-provoking part of Ehrman's book. The stark contrast he draws between the Christ we see in Revelation and the Jesus we meet in the Gospels. How does he lay out that difference?
He paints a very, very sharp contrast. In Revelation, Ehrman argues, Christ comes across as a wrathful warrior king.
Okay.
Driven by vengeance, actively inflicting violence, demanding absolute obedience, or remember the term slaves, and promising very material rewards and earthly dominance to his followers. Some reviewers even summarized his portrayal as a Christ who is basically out for blood.
Oof. And how does that image compare to the Jesus we see in, say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
Well, the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels, in Ehrman's portrayal, is fundamentally different. He's the peaceful servant.
Right.
Consistently teaching love, mercy, humility, forgiveness. He explicitly rejects violence, rejects worldly power, says his kingdom isn't of this world. He warns against wealth and emphasizes caring for the poor, the marginalized.
So in Ehrman's view, these are essentially two completely irreconcilable figures. You can't really square them?
Absolutely. That's his conclusion. He thinks the author of Revelation, this John of Patmos, either fundamentally misunderstood Jesus' teachings or maybe even intentionally misrepresented them. He goes so far as to suggest that the God depicted in Revelation, with all the focus on violence and vengeance, cannot possibly be the same loving, merciful God that Jesus revealed in the Gospels.
That's a very strong claim, and it certainly ties into Ehrman's broader work, doesn't it? His overall scholarship.
It absolutely does. A big part of Ehrman's academic work explores the diversity, the disagreements within early Christianity,
Yeah, he writes a lot about that.
and how that diversity challenges traditional ideas about biblical inerrancy or a single unified message. By highlighting this seemingly irreconcilable conflict between Christ in Revelation and Jesus in the Gospels, he's reinforcing his arguments about how complex and sometimes contradictory the New Testament canon actually is.
And understandably, that perspective draws significant criticism.
Oh, absolutely, especially from those holding more traditional views of Scripture.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit now to Ehrman's methodology itself. He makes some specific arguments about who actually wrote the book of Revelation, right? Not the Apostle John.
Yes, exactly. He aligns with what's really the consensus view in modern critical scholarship. The John who wrote Revelation is not the same John as the Apostle John, the one traditionally credited with the fourth gospel in the letters of John.
And his reasoning.
He points to pretty substantial differences: writing style, vocabulary, grammar. Even major theological themes are quite different between Revelation and the other Johannine writings.
Interesting.
Even early church figures, like Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria back in the 3rd century, recognized these distinctions. Plus, Ehrman emphasizes, the author of Revelation himself never actually claims to be one of the 12 apostles. He just calls himself John, a servant.
And this is another point where more conservative scholars often push back.
It definitely is. They often argue that Ehrman and other critical scholars tend to downplay the evidence that could support apostolic authorship. They might point to early church testimonies that did attribute it to the apostle, or argue for underlying thematic connections between all the Johannine writings.
Or suggest maybe the style difference isn't that significant?
Right. Or that stylistic variations could be explained by other factors, like using a different scribe or writing under very different circumstances. It's an ongoing debate.
What about how Revelation even got into the Bible,
Right.
the canonization process? Does Ehrman shed any light on that?
He does. He highlights the fact that Revelation's inclusion in the New Testament canon was actually quite controversial for a long time. It faced significant resistance in the early church.
Why was that?
Well, many early Christians were hesitant. Its imagery is bizarre, let's face it. The content is very violent. And there were these persistent questions about who actually wrote it.
So it wasn't an easy acceptance?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Ehrman suggests its eventual acceptance might have been influenced by how useful it seemed in certain theological debates, or because influential church leaders championed it.
Yeah.
However,
Yes.
those holding more traditional views often argue the canonization process wasn't just about politics or usefulness. They believe it was guided more by the church recognizing an inherent spiritual authority within the text itself.
Okay. We touched on the historical context earlier, but are there any broader methodological criticisms that people level against Ehrman's work in general, looking at the responses to this book?
Yes, there are several recurring critiques worth mentioning. Some reviewers and scholars feel Ehrman sometimes makes very strong interpretive claims without always backing them up with, extensive textual evidence, or fully engaging with alternative scholarly views that might contradict him.
Okay.
There are also times where critics argue he might blur the line between simply describing what the text says and actively imposing his own interpretation onto it.
Reading too much into it, perhaps.
That's the criticism sometimes. Also, his tendency to frame scholarly debates as these stark dichotomies, like there's the wrong popular view, and then there's his corrective view, that's sometimes seen as oversimplifying what are often more complex and nuanced academic discussions.
And what about his personal background? He famously moved away from evangelical Christianity. Does that history influence how his work is seen or critiqued?
It undoubtedly plays a role, yes. His personal journey, from being a conservative evangelical to becoming agnostic, gives him a unique insider perspective. He's very familiar with the theological viewpoints he's critiquing.
Which can make his work very impactful for some readers.
Absolutely. Especially for people maybe questioning their own faith. But it also opens him up to accusations of potential bias from those within more traditional faith communities.
They might see it as an agenda.
Sometimes, yes. His interpretations are sometimes characterized by critics as being, overly negative or maybe primarily focused on debunking beliefs rather than offering a more balanced understanding. And that selective use of literal interpretation we talked about, particularly with the millennium, that's another methodological point critics frequently raise.
Okay, so keeping all those criticisms in mind, what are some of the key counterarguments? What alternative scholarly perspectives push back against Ehrman's interpretation of Revelation? Let's start with that core issue of violence.
Right. Many scholars challenge Ehrman's characterization of Revelation as primarily promoting vengeance. They often emphasize a crucial distinction: divine judgment versus human action. Meaning, they argue the violence depicted is God's sovereign act of retribution against cosmic evil. It's not meant as a model or justification for humans to be violent.
Ah, okay.
They point out that the book consistently calls believers to endure suffering patiently, not to retaliate. And they highlight that Christ's ultimate victory is portrayed as being achieved through sacrifice, symbolized by the lamb who was slain, not just through force.
So the lamb conquers as a lamb.
Exactly. Some also argue that, historically speaking, mainstream Christian traditions haven't typically used Revelation to incite violence, and they offer alternative readings of specific passages, like interpreting clean as a sickbed, representing divine chastisement, not sexual degradation.
Okay. And what about Ehrman's view on wealth and materialism in Revelation? How is that challenged?
Critics often suggest Ehrman takes those descriptions of the New Jerusalem, the gold, the jewels, far too literally.
They see it as symbolic.
Primarily symbolic, yes. Representing God's ultimate glory, the incredible value of salvation, the beauty of the divine realm. Not necessarily an endorsement of earthly materialism or a promise of literal riches.
And the whole wealth transfer idea.
That idea, especially the notion of a literal transfer during the millennium where earthly riches just change hands, is widely seen by other scholars as an extreme, perhaps even uncharitable interpretation of the text's intent.
We've talked about the millennium quite a bit. Are there other major ways scholars interpret that thousand-year reign besides Ehrman's vengeful premillennial view?
Oh, absolutely. Throughout church history, many influential theologians have read the 1,000 years symbolically.
How so?
Well, one major view, known as amillennialism, sees it as representing the current spiritual reign of Christ happening now in the hearts of believers during the church age, or maybe Christ's present reign in heaven with the souls of those who have died in faith.
So, not a future literal kingdom on earth.
Exactly. These symbolic interpretations stand in stark contrast to Ehrman's focus on a literal earthly reign where resurrected martyrs get revenge. His strong focus on that specific, vengeful premillennial view tends to overlook these other significant interpreted frameworks.
Like postmillennialism.
Right, postmillennialism, which envisions a future golden age of peace and righteousness on earth leading up to Christ's return, and various preterist views that see the millennium as something already fulfilled back in the early church era. There's a much wider spectrum of views.
And what about that central point of contention, the apparent clash between Jesus in the Gospels and Christ in Revelation? How do other scholars try to reconcile those portrayals?
Many theologians argue Ehrman creates an overly stark and ultimately maybe a false dichotomy there.
They think the two can be reconciled.
They do. They point out that the Gospels themselves aren't all peace and love. They contain strong themes of divine judgment, too. Jesus himself makes claims to divine authority that definitely imply a future reckoning.
So it's not completely out of character.
They would argue it isn't. They see the different portrayals as reflecting different aspects of Christ's identity and mission. He was the suffering servant during his first earthly ministry.
And he'll be the returning judge and king in glory.
Exactly. They see it as theological tension within Scripture, perhaps, rather than outright contradiction. And again, that powerful image of the Lamb conquering as Lamb through sacrifice is key for them. It suggests Christ's power isn't just about brute force or vengeance.
It really sounds like there's a much broader, more nuanced range of interpretations of Revelation than Ehrman's analysis might initially lead you to believe.
Precisely. You have scholars like Craig Koester, who emphasizes the rich liturgical and symbolic dimensions, seeing Revelation as this powerful drama meant for worship, for encouragement.
Okay.
Then there's Adela Yarbrough Collins, who focuses on it, offering hope and resistance to early Christians facing social pressures, and as a critique of Roman imperial power and its idolatry. And someone like Richard Bauckham highlights Revelation's intricate theological coherence, its consistent critique of that imperial idolatry. That contrasts pretty sharply with Ehrman's emphasis on theological divergence and vengeful themes.
This has been incredibly insightful. Now, Ehrman also delves into the social and political implications of these different ways of interpreting Revelation. What are his main concerns there?
His primary concerns often revolve around a potential apathy towards present global issues.
Apathy. How so?
Well, he argues that if individuals truly believe the world is destined for imminent destruction by God anyway, they might feel less motivated to tackle long-term problems like, say, climate change or poverty or social injustice. Why bother polishing brass on a sinking ship, right?
I see the logic there. Any other concerns?
He also draws connections between certain literalistic apocalyptic interpretations, particularly within some strands of Christian Zionism and specific foreign policy stances,
Like supporting the modern state of Israel.
suggesting that sometimes unwavering support for Israel is rooted in a desire to see specific biblical prophecies fulfilled as a prerequisite for the end times. Additionally, he does express concern about the potential for extreme, literalistic interpretations to possibly fuel religious fanaticism or even violence, although he's careful to acknowledge that mainstream Christianity generally does not advocate violence based on revelation.
But again, I imagine there are counter-arguments to these points about the social and political fallout.
Yes, definitely. Critics argue Ehrman might be overgeneralizing the impact of apocalyptic beliefs.
How?
They point out that many people who hold various end times views are still incredibly active in charitable work, social justice, environmental care, often precisely because of their faith, not in spite of it. They don't see it as fatalism.
So motivation is complex.
Exactly. And political viewpoints are shaped by tons of factors, not just one aspect of theology like eschatology. Some even argue that the hope found within apocalyptic visions can actually be a powerful source of resilience, a motivation for positive social change, especially when facing suffering or injustice.
So as we bring this deep dive toward a close, what are the most critical takeaways? What should our listener really remember from our exploration of Ehrman's Armageddon and all the responses it sparked?
Okay, well, the central takeaway has to be Ehrman's core argument.
Yeah.
He fundamentally challenges common assumptions about how to read Revelation. He insists on seeing it as a first-century text soaked in its specific historical context.
Right, aimed at the Roman Empire.
Exactly. Primarily concerned, in his view, with divine vengeance against Rome. And he posits that fundamental, perhaps irreconcilable conflict between the violent Christ of Revelation and the peaceful Jesus of the Gospels.
But it's not the only view.
Absolutely not. It's crucial for you to understand that his interpretations, especially regarding the nature of divine violence, that whole wealth transfer idea, the literalness of the millennium, and that stark dichotomy between Jesus and Christ, they are hotly debated. They are not universally accepted in biblical scholarship.
What's the pushback?
Lots. Many scholars offer compelling alternative readings. They emphasize the symbolic language, the overall theological coherence of Scripture, a more nuanced view of both Revelation and the Gospels. And finally, while Ehrman raises important questions about the social and political impact of apocalyptic beliefs, those connections are also complex and very open to different perspectives.
Okay. Considering Ehrman's challenging arguments and this really diverse range of scholarly responses we've talked about, what's a thought-provoking question our listener could take away from this? Something about the enduring power of interpreting these ancient texts today.
Maybe something like this. How much do our own modern contexts, our pre-existing beliefs, even our deepest hopes and fears, how much do those inevitably shape how we understand ancient, often highly symbolic, religious texts like Revelation?
That's a good one.
And maybe what are the potential benefits, but also the potential dangers of prioritizing one particular interpretive lens over others when we engage with Scripture?
That's a powerful question to ponder, definitely. So if our listener wants to keep exploring this fascinating topic, maybe form their own informed opinions, where do you suggest they go next?
Well, naturally, reading Bart Ehrman's Armageddon itself is the essential first step to really get his specific arguments in detail.
Makes sense.
But I would also strongly encourage exploring the works of some of the other prominent scholars we've mentioned, people like Craig Koester, Adele Yarbrough-Collins, Richard Bauckham. Reading them gives you a much broader sense of the diverse ways Revelation has been, and still is, interpreted in the academic world.
At the full conversation.
Exactly. And ultimately, maybe the best thing is to go back to the primary text itself, with the book of Revelation, but read it now with these different scholarly perspectives rattling around in your head. That can be an incredibly enriching and maybe illuminating experience for anyone trying to understand this really complex and influential book.